My husband walked out of the courthouse with a smile on his face and $5 million in his pocket. Reporters surrounded him. Friends congratulated him. He believed he had just destroyed me and won everything we spent 12 years building together. Exactly 60 minutes later, a government investigator received a file that would turn his greatest victory into the beginning of his downfall. Stick with me, because what happened next changed both of our lives forever. My name is Sabrina Whitaker. For more than 12 years, I helped build Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group with my husband, Preston Vaughn. When we first started, we had very little. We worked long hours and sacrificed weekends, holidays, and countless nights to make the company successful. I handled operations, finances, and client relationships. Preston became the public face of the business. Together, we built something we were proud of. As the company grew, so did Preston's need for control. At first, the changes were small. He started making decisions without talking to me. He excluded me from important meetings and stopped sharing information that I had always helped manage. I told myself he was simply stressed. Running a growing company was difficult, and I wanted to support him. But over time, his behavior became impossible to ignore. 3 years before our divorce, Preston began removing me from key responsibilities. My opinions no longer mattered. Important documents stopped reaching my desk. It felt like I was becoming a stranger inside the company I helped create. Then I discovered financial records that didn't make sense. Certain transactions looked unusual. Some numbers didn't match. When I asked questions, Preston became defensive and angry. Instead of providing answers, he accused me of not trusting him. Those arguments slowly destroyed our marriage. Not long afterward, Preston filed for divorce. What followed was a brutal legal battle over Iron Ridge. Month after month, we fought in court. Lawyers examined every detail of our lives and our business. When the final ruling came, the judge decided mostly in Preston's favor. He walked away with what looked like a complete victory. Reporters praised him. Business associates celebrated with him. Everyone believed the story was over. But they were wrong. While Preston celebrated outside the courthouse, someone else was carrying a secret that had been hidden for years. A man weighed down by guilt had finally decided he could not stay silent any longer. And his decision was about to change everything. When Preston and I first met, he was the kind of man who inspired confidence. He worked harder than anyone I knew and always talked about building a better future. His ambition attracted me. He had big dreams, and I believed in every one of them. In those early years, we were true partners. We worked side by side to build Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group from the ground up. We celebrated every small victory together. When problems came, we faced them as a team. I trusted him completely, and he trusted me. As the company grew, our lives improved. New clients arrived. Revenue increased. The future looked brighter than ever. I thought we were building something that would support our family for years to come. But success changed Preston. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. He spent more time talking about power and influence. He became focused on being recognized as the person responsible for the company's success. I assumed the pressure of leadership was affecting him. Then he started making important decisions without consulting me. For years, we had discussed every major choice together. Suddenly, meetings happened without my knowledge. Contracts were signed before I had a chance to review them. When I asked why, he always had an excuse. Soon, he became secretive about company finances. As someone responsible for operations and accounting, that worried me. I began noticing transactions that seemed unusual. Some payments appeared unnecessary. Certain records looked incomplete. Whenever I asked questions, Preston immediately became defensive. Instead of answering, he accused me of doubting him. The conversations often ended in arguments. The more questions I asked, the more distant he became. It felt like he was building a wall between us. The man who once shared every dream and every challenge with me slowly disappeared. In his place stood someone completely different. Preston became obsessed with winning. Everything became a competition. Every disagreement had to end with him being right. Every situation became about control. The partnership we once shared no longer existed. I kept hoping things would improve. I convinced myself that stress was causing his behavior. I wanted to believe the man I married was still there somewhere. What I didn't realize was that Preston's changes were not temporary. While I was trying to save our marriage, he was already planning for a future without me. Behind closed doors, he was quietly rewriting our story, preparing moves I couldn't yet see, and setting plans into motion that would eventually change everything. While most people inside Iron Ridge believed everything was running smoothly, one employee quietly noticed things that nobody else questioned. His name was Garrett Sloan. Garrett worked in the accounting department. He was known for being careful, organized, and honest. Numbers were his responsibility, and he took that responsibility seriously. Every report, invoice, and transaction passed through his hands at some point. At first, he thought the unusual financial records were simple mistakes. Large companies often have accounting errors. Missing paperwork and incorrect entries happen from time to time. Garrett assumed that was all he was seeing. But as months passed, the problems continued. He started finding money transfers connected to companies he had never heard of before. Some of those companies had almost no public information. Others seemed to exist only on paper. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. Certain records didn't match the company's financial reports. Approval signatures looked different from earlier versions. Some transactions seemed to be changed after they had already been processed. Most troubling of all, money appeared to disappear from one account and later show up somewhere else under different descriptions. Garrett checked the numbers repeatedly, hoping he had made a mistake. But every review led him back to the same conclusion. Something was wrong. Finally, he decided to raise his concerns. He prepared a report and requested a meeting with Preston Vaughn. Garrett expected questions, maybe even an internal investigation. Instead, something unexpected happened. Within weeks, Preston promoted him. His salary increased significantly. He received new responsibilities and better benefits. On the surface, it looked like a reward for his hard work. But Garrett understood the real message. Stay quiet. Don't ask questions. Don't look any deeper. For a while, he accepted the situation. He convinced himself that he needed the job. He had bills to pay, responsibilities to manage, and a future to protect. Walking away seemed impossible. So he stayed. Years passed, but the guilt never disappeared. Every time he found another suspicious record, the feeling grew stronger. Every time he ignored something that didn't make sense, the burden became heavier. Then the divorce between Preston and me began. Garrett watched from a distance as Preston fought to take control of everything we had built together. He saw the accusations, the legal attacks, and the way Preston tried to erase my contributions to the company. For Garrett, that was the hardest part. The financial records already troubled him. But watching an innocent person become a target made the guilt impossible to ignore. And with every court hearing, he came closer to making a decision that would change all of our lives forever. The courtroom became the place where my entire life was rewritten. For months, I sat through hearing after hearing, listening as lawyers, witnesses, and documents painted a picture that barely resembled reality. Every day felt like watching someone erase years of my hard work and replace it with a completely different story. Preston's legal team came prepared. They presented documents claiming that he was responsible for most of Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group's success. According to their records, he had made the important decisions, secured the biggest clients, and carried the company forward almost single-handedly. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. For more than a decade, I had worked beside him. I handled operations, finances, and client relationships. I spent countless hours helping build the company from the ground up. Yet somehow, those contributions seemed to disappear whenever new evidence appeared in court. Witnesses supported Preston's version of events. Some were employees. Others were business associates. They described him as the driving force behind the company. Listening to them was painful because many of them knew the truth. Many had seen how much work I put into Iron Ridge over the years. But inside that courtroom, their stories sounded very different. The records presented by Preston's lawyers minimized my role at every opportunity. Reports showed responsibilities being shifted away from me. Important decisions appeared under Preston's name alone. Documents that should have reflected years of partnership suddenly showed a completely different reality. Everything felt carefully planned. After each hearing, I left with more questions than answers. I kept wondering how the truth could look so different once it entered a courtroom. How could years of work vanish from official records? How could so many details suddenly favor one person? At the time, I couldn't understand it. Looking back now, the answer seems obvious. Preston wasn't reacting to our divorce. He had been preparing for it. Long before our marriage collapsed, he had already started changing records, shifting responsibilities, and creating a version of history that benefited him. The legal battle did not begin when he filed for divorce. It began years earlier, while I still believed we were building a future together. That realization hurt more than the divorce itself. It meant the betrayal had started long before I ever noticed. When the final day arrived and the judge announced the verdict, the courtroom became completely silent. Then I looked at Preston. He smiled immediately. Not with relief. Not with surprise. It was the smile of someone who expected exactly that outcome. Almost as if he had known all along how the story would end. At least, that's what he believed at the time. The night before the court announced its final verdict, Garrett Sloan sat alone in his apartment staring at a thick binder resting on his kitchen table. For months, he had been collecting information in secret. Every time he discovered something suspicious at Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group, he saved a copy. At first, he told himself he was only keeping records for protection. But over time, the collection grew into something much larger. Inside the binder were emails, internal reports, financial records, authorization logs, and copies of transactions that had later been deleted from company systems. Each document told part of a story. By themselves, they looked like small pieces of information. Together, they revealed a pattern. Garrett spent countless evenings reviewing files after work. He compared reports from different years. He checked signatures, dates, and approvals. Whenever something didn't make sense, he searched deeper. The more he investigated, the more concerned he became. The evidence pointed toward years of manipulation inside the company. There were records showing hidden assets that had never been properly disclosed. Financial transfers moved through accounts connected to unfamiliar businesses. Some documents appear to have been altered after they were created. Several approvals looked suspicious. Important records contained information that changed over time without explanation. Garrett carefully organized everything. He arranged the documents by date and created notes explaining what each record showed. He wanted anyone reviewing the evidence to understand the full picture. What troubled him most was not the unusual transactions. It was who appeared connected to them. Again and again, the documents pointed back to Preston Vaughn. The records linked him directly to decisions he had repeatedly denied making. Emails showed instructions being given behind the scenes. Authorization records connected his office to actions that publicly seemed to come from someone else. Garrett knew these details could change everything. He also knew they could destroy his career. If he handed over the file, there would be no turning back. His employers would likely discover what he had done. Friends at the company might stop speaking to him. His future could become uncertain overnight. For a long time, fear kept him silent. But watching the divorce case unfold made that silence harder to live with. Every court hearing increased his guilt. Every accusation against Sabrina made him feel worse. He knew information existed that could help reveal the truth, yet he continued saying nothing. That night, he finally made his choice. He closed the binder and placed it inside a secure bag. His hands shook as he prepared to leave. He understood that his life would change forever once he delivered that file. But he also understood something else. The truth had been buried long enough, and he could no longer help keep it hidden. After leaving the courthouse, Preston Vaughn acted like a man who had conquered the world. The court had ruled mostly in his favor, and he wasted no time celebrating. That evening, he hosted a private gathering at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. The room was filled with executives, business partners, lawyers, and close associates who had supported him throughout the legal battle. The atmosphere felt more like a victory party than a simple dinner. Champagne bottles were opened one after another. Glasses were raised high into the air. Laughter filled the room as guests congratulated Preston on what they called a remarkable achievement. Many of them believed they were witnessing the final chapter of the story. According to everything they had seen, Preston had won. He had walked away with control, money, and the public image he had fought so hard to protect. As the evening continued, Preston stood proudly at the center of the room. People gathered around him, eager to shake his hand and offer praise. Several guests described him as a brilliant businessman. Others called him a fighter who had overcome difficult challenges. Preston accepted every compliment with a smile. Eventually, he stood to give a speech. The room became quiet as everyone listened. He spoke about perseverance. He talked about hard work and sacrifice. He described the court's decision as proof that justice had prevailed. According to Preston, the truth had finally been recognized. The guests responded with loud applause. Many believed every word. Meanwhile, across town, a very different meeting was taking place. Garrett Sloan parked his car outside a government office building. The evidence binder sat beside him on the passenger seat. For several minutes, he remained inside the car, staring at the building. This was the moment he had been thinking about for months. Once he walked through those doors, there would be no turning back. Finally, he picked up the binder and entered the building. Inside, he was escorted to a private office where an investigator named Naomi Keller waited. Garrett placed the binder on her desk. Then he began explaining what he had discovered. Naomi listened carefully. As she reviewed the documents, her expression slowly changed. She turned pages, examined records, and asked detailed questions. Within minutes, she understood the seriousness of the allegations. The information suggested far more than simple accounting errors. The documents pointed toward a much larger problem. Naomi immediately began taking action. Requests were prepared. Records were flagged for review. The first steps of an official investigation started that very day. At that exact moment, Preston was still standing in the restaurant, smiling as people celebrated around him. He had no idea that while he was enjoying his greatest victory, the foundation beneath his world had already begun to crack. Exactly 1 hour after the court announced its verdict, everything began to change. While Preston Vaughn continued celebrating his victory at the restaurant, Naomi Keller and her team were already reviewing the evidence Garrett Sloan had delivered earlier that day. The binder contained hundreds of pages. Emails, financial reports, approval records, transaction histories, and internal company documents filled every section. Naomi knew she could not ignore what she was seeing. The allegations were serious. Within a short time, investigators began taking action. Requests for financial records were issued immediately. Teams started gathering information from multiple sources to verify the documents Garrett had provided. The goal was simple: preserve important records before anything could disappear. As investigators examined the material, several company accounts quickly attracted attention. Certain transactions appeared unusual. Some transfers involved companies that seemed unrelated to Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group. Other records showed activity that required further explanation. The more investigators reviewed, the more questions emerged. Naomi understood that speed mattered. If the documents were accurate, delaying action could allow important evidence to be lost. Her team moved quickly to secure records and begin building a clearer picture of what had happened over the years. Soon, phone calls started spreading throughout Iron Ridge. Managers received requests for information. Department heads were asked to preserve documents. Employees noticed unusual activity and began talking among themselves. Rumors traveled through the company faster than anyone expected. People who had spent years feeling secure suddenly became nervous. Executives started asking questions. Some wanted to know why investigators were reviewing company records. Others worried about what might be discovered. No one seemed to have clear answers. At the same time, attorneys connected to the company began receiving notices and inquiries. The confident tone many had shown after the court victory slowly faded. Conversations that had sounded relaxed earlier in the day suddenly became tense. Meanwhile, Preston remained at the restaurant. For most of the evening, he continued accepting congratulations and enjoying the attention. He believed the hardest part of his life was finally over. Then his phone rang. The message he received was brief, but alarming. Authorities were looking into company records. At first, He dismissed it as a misunderstanding. But as additional calls arrived, the situation became harder to ignore. For the first time that entire day, confidence disappeared from his face. Guests noticed the change immediately. The man who had been smiling moments earlier suddenly looked distracted. His answers became shorter. His attention shifted away from the celebration. The atmosphere in the room changed. Before long, the gathering ended much earlier than planned. People quietly left the restaurant, unsure of what was happening. Most believed it was only a minor issue. Nobody yet understood how serious the investigation would become. And nobody knew that Preston's greatest victory was already beginning to fall apart. As the investigation continued, more information started coming to light. What initially looked like a few suspicious transactions quickly grew into something much larger. Naomi Keller and her team spent weeks reviewing financial records, internal communications, and company documents connected to Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. The evidence suggested that Preston Vaughn had spent years moving money through hidden channels. Several financial transfers followed complicated paths that made them difficult to trace. Funds moved between different accounts and businesses before eventually reaching their final destinations. On paper, everything appeared normal. But investigators soon realized the system was designed that way. The complexity was not accidental. It made the movement of money harder to follow and concealed assets that should have been easier to identify. As investigators continued their review, they discovered additional problems. Records appeared to have been altered over time. Some documents contained information that changed without explanation. Certain approvals were modified. Dates seemed inconsistent. Important files showed signs of being adjusted long after they were originally created. The more evidence they uncovered, the more concerned they became. Then they discovered something that affected me personally. Years before Preston ever filed for divorce, company records had started changing in subtle ways. Responsibilities that once belonged to me were reassigned on paper. Projects I helped manage appeared under different names. Important decisions that involved both of us were gradually rewritten to make it seem as though Preston had handled them alone. At first, the changes seemed small. But when investigators examined them together, a clear pattern emerged. My role inside the company had been slowly reduced in official records over several years. The timing was impossible to ignore. These changes began long before our marriage collapsed. Long before lawyers became involved. Long before anyone mentioned divorce. That discovery changed everything I thought I knew. For years, I believed Preston's actions were driven by fear after our relationship started failing. I assumed he was reacting to circumstances as they happened. The evidence told a different story. He wasn't simply protecting himself. He had been preparing. Investigators concluded that many of the changes appeared designed to strengthen his position if a legal dispute ever occurred. The records created a version of history that favored him and minimized my contributions. Everything seemed carefully planned. Every adjustment, every altered document, every misleading record, every decision. The realization was painful. I had spent years believing we were building a future together while Preston was quietly creating a backup plan that excluded me. The financial issues were serious, but the betrayal hurt even more, because it showed that the person I trusted most had been planning against me for years. And the deeper investigators dug, the worse the truth became. Months after the investigation began, the situation surrounding Preston Vaughn reached a breaking point. What had started as a review of financial records had grown into a much larger examination of years of company activity. Investigators had gathered documents, interviewed employees, and reviewed thousands of records connected to Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group. The evidence continued to grow. As more information became public, people who once stood proudly beside Preston began creating distance between themselves and him. Business partners who had supported him for years suddenly became cautious. Some paused projects. Others ended partnerships completely. They did not want their names connected to an expanding investigation. Investors became nervous as well. Questions about the company's future started appearing everywhere. People who had once viewed Iron Ridge as stable now worried about what might happen next. Confidence slowly disappeared. Inside the company, the pressure continued to build. Several executives eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators. Some provided documents. Others answered questions about decisions made over the years. Information that had remained hidden for a long time was finally coming into the open. Then came one of the most important moments of the entire investigation. Garrett Sloan agreed to testify. For years, he had carried the weight of what he knew. Now, he finally had the opportunity to explain everything. He described the unusual transactions he had discovered. He explained the records that failed to match. He discussed altered approvals, hidden transfers, and the evidence he had collected over time. Most importantly, he helped investigators understand how different pieces of information connected together. His testimony filled important gaps. The documents told part of the story. Garrett helped explain the rest. As investigators combined his testimony with the growing collection of evidence, the picture became impossible to ignore. Years of hidden activity were now connected. The explanations Preston had relied on for so long became harder to defend. One by one, his defenses started collapsing. Arguments that once sounded convincing no longer held up under closer examination. Documents contradicted earlier claims. Witnesses challenged previous statements. Evidence continued to point investigators in the same direction. The courtroom victory that had once seemed untouchable began falling apart. The confidence Preston displayed outside the courthouse months earlier was gone. His reputation suffered greatly. People who once admired him now questioned everything. His company suffered too. Business opportunities disappeared. Trust weakened. Relationships built over many years started breaking apart. The empire Preston had fought so hard to control was no longer growing. It was shrinking. Every new discovery added pressure. Every new piece of evidence weakened his position. And as the investigation reached its peak, the foundation he had spent years building began to crumble around him, leaving him unable to stop the collapse that was now unfolding in front of everyone. A year later, everything looked different. The chaos, court hearings, investigations, and endless uncertainty that once filled my life had finally settled. For the first time in years, I could wake up each morning without wondering what new problem would appear that day. Iron Ridge Manufacturing Group was no longer the company Preston Vaughn once controlled. The business that had seemed untouchable during his courtroom victory had changed dramatically. Leadership changed. Internal systems were reviewed. Many of the people who had supported Preston during the investigation were no longer involved with the company. Some left voluntarily. Others simply disappeared when standing beside him was no longer beneficial. The crowd that once surrounded him during his celebration had become much smaller. The image he spent years building was gone. For a long time, Preston worked hard to present himself as the successful businessman who achieved everything on his own. He wanted people to see strength, confidence, and control. But once the truth emerged, that image became impossible to maintain. People saw a different story. They saw years of manipulation, deception, and choices that eventually caught up with him. As for me, my life slowly improved. The legal battle that once felt like the end of everything became the beginning of something new. For a long time, I believed I had lost the future I worked so hard to build. I was wrong. Sometimes losing what is broken creates space for something better. I focused on rebuilding my career, reconnecting with people I trusted, and creating a life that no longer depended on someone else's approval. It wasn't easy. Healing never happens overnight. But with time, I found peace again. One afternoon, I found myself driving past the courthouse where everything had seemed to end 1 year earlier. I slowed down and looked at the building. Memories immediately came rushing back. I remembered standing inside that courtroom. I remembered the judge's decision. And I remembered Preston's smile as he walked outside believing he had won. I remembered the confidence on his face, the certainty in his voice, the way he acted as if the story was over. At that moment, he truly believed he had beaten me. But some victories are built on lies, and lies never stay hidden forever. The truth may move slowly. It may take months or even years to appear, but eventually it finds its way to the surface. As I drove away, I realized something important. The court ruling had not defined my future. Neither had Preston. The truth had done that. Preston won for 1 hour. Then, everything changed. He spent years planning for victory. Yet in the end, the very lies that helped him rise became the reason he fell. And that was something he could never escape.